The first thing I say to a person who comes to me in the way you've described, I say to them, where would you be without your story? Where do you think you'd be if you didn't have a story that you're not good enough, you're not worthy, you're not there, you're not doing it right, you can never get it right, you're not okay, you have much to do in order to improve? Where would you be without your story?
Welcome back to I Just Have to Say with Laura Max. I am here with an author I discovered when I was 19 years old, reading one of his books, Happier Than God, in my college dormitory at Northeastern University. Neale Donald Walsch, welcome to I Just Have to Say with Laura Max.
Thank you, Laura. It's lovely to be here with you, and I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share with your audience what it is I've been given to share. Now, how can I serve you?
Oh, I love that you asked that question, and you've already served me in so many ways. So I'm just excited to ask you all these questions. So hopefully anyone who's listening can also be served by what you've offered the world. And if you don't know who Neale is, if you do know who he is, he needs no introduction. But if you don't know who he is, I'm going to brief you quickly on that. Neale Donald Walsch is the author of the Conversations with God series. Leading up to writing that book, he experienced a series of major, very challenging events, including a car accident that left him with a broken neck, the breakup of his marriage, a fire that destroyed all of his belongings, all of which led him to write his first book, which was first published in 1995 and became an international bestseller. It remained on the New York Times bestsellers list for 135 weeks. 6 of his other books have made the Times list in the year since. He has published 40 books, and his works have been translated into 37 languages. And I am here to talk to him about his most recent book, which is called GODTALK, which it was an absolute pleasure to read. First off, Neale, what I love so much about you and what I love so much about you when I read Happier Than God, which was not your first book, but it was the first book of yours that I ever read. It really was my first introduction to the fact that I could have this connection with God that was very personal, because that certainly wasn't what I learned growing up, and it's not what most of us did. And it was essentially inviting me to have a friendship with God and to have a relationship with a God that was a God of love, a God that wanted what was best for me. I loved reading that book, and I loved everything that I learned from reading that book. I can only imagine what you have faced having written these books, having discussed your interactions with God, that you've probably received a lot of pushback. And you talk about that in GODTALK, that when you are open to an idea of a God that can actually speak to us, people are probably going to be a little bit skeptical. You've written 40 books. How have you managed to do that in spite of the fact that I'm sure many people have called you crazy in your life?
Allowing myself to know that it doesn't matter what people say about me, either negatively or frankly positively. I mean, I don't listen to my own press releases and press clippings and press notices, either positive or negative. I share with you that I have received some negative pushback to what I've written, and I've received a bunch of positive pushback. You know what? I had to decide it very early in the process to simply ignore what people had to say about me and what the press had to say about me. I just let it be what it is. And I think it's the way we should be with other people. Allow them to have their own experience. And as long as they're not abusive about it, and deliberately harmful to me, but if it's just simply an expression of their opinion, fair enough. And so I say to people who dramatically disagree with me, fair enough. I have no need to convince you of anything. Stick with your beliefs, stand up for what you believe is true. And if we all stand up for what we believe is true in our hearts and do so non-violently, we'll create a better world virtually overnight.
I'm so glad that you've done that, because I know so many people have benefited from what you've shared. And what's so interesting about the fact that what you share is not necessarily thought of as common knowledge, that we could have conversations with God. We don't tend to think of God that way. You talk about in your book, GODTALK, that actually, according to anthropological studies, 8 in 10 people believe in God, and that many agree that God spoke to famous biblical figures that we all know about. And in nearly every case in which someone believe they've spoken to God, they believe that they've been changed forever. And they, especially if they've put into practice what God has said to them. Now, if someone is listening to this and this idea of having a conversation with God or speaking with God is completely foreign to them, I want you to answer, how does God speak to us? Because he's obviously not coming down and having conversations with us in English most of the time. You discuss this in your book. How does God speak to you, and how does God speak to all of us every day? You say in your book that God is speaking to us all the time. He's always listening and he's always responding. So I can imagine some people would hear that and say, what are you talking about? I've never experienced that before. What does that look like? How does God speak to us?
I'm going to use the word communicate.
Okay.
How God communicates with us, because sometimes it's in the form of an actual sentence or two, or a thought that comes to us as a sentence or two, and we can even write it down if we choose to. Sometimes it's just a signal, an event in our life. The lyrics of the next song you hear on the radio. You're driving down the road, really thinking deeply about a personal problem, and on the radio comes a song, the lyrics of which just happened by coincidence to be directing their attention to precisely what you're thinking about and providing you the answer. Or maybe it's the chance utterance of a friend you happen to encounter on the sidewalk that you haven't seen in 8 years. And he just happens to say something. And you look at him and say, I can't believe you just said that. This has been worrying me for the past 5 weeks. Or maybe it's a conversation you overhear in the coffee shop. My point being that God communicates with us in 100 different ways across 1,000 moments in every one of our multiple lifetimes. And sometimes it actually does feel like a conversation. And we might even ask in our head, God, what do you think I should do about this? Or God, what do I do about that? I need some advice here. And sometimes we get a whole slew of thoughts in response. Now, not many people actually write them down. But I did, never dreaming that what I was writing down would ever become a book. Laura, I was having a very personal, private, singular experience. I never imagined anyone else would ever even learn about it, much less know what I was told. As you mentioned, I was going through an extremely challenging time in my life. And when I had what I called the triple whammy. I lost my relationship, I lost my job, and I lost my health, all within the same 10-day period.
A lot to happen at once. It's a lot to happen at once. And it also begs the question, and something that I was going to ask you is, I'm sure people talk to you all the time. Hey, Neale, what does God say about why bad things happen to good people? Well, here you are, and you've experienced all of these traumas, right? And look what ends up happening. You write this book that's touched millions of people throughout the world. Do you feel like you've been given an answer to that? Because that I know when I talk to my rabbi, he always says that's the number one reason why people come into his office. They want to know why bad things happen to good people. They want to know why. They want an explanation. Do you feel like you've been given an explanation for that?
Yes, I have, but it's a very unorthodox explanation that could rile up some people. I was told that bad things never happen to people.
Oh, I love that.
I was told that everything that occurs in your life, whether you call it welcome or unwelcome, serves you in terms of the agenda that you embraced when you incarnated into the realm of the physical. So that what I have learned since my conversation with God, I've learned how to embrace, to hold, and to respond as opposed to react. How to respond to every one of the events in my life, including those which are not so welcome.
I love that. And I'm Jewish, and one of my favorite Jewish beliefs is that we are meant to take the highest possible meaning from everything that happens to us, which I think is a lot of what you just said. So if something happens to us, if something happens to us that feels really traumatic or really difficult, when I ask myself that question right away, okay, why is this happening and what can I take away from it that would benefit me or anybody around me? What's the highest good here? It often doesn't feel as bad as it would feel otherwise. And you have, in your book, God Talk, you have a lot of people share their stories about their communications with God. And one that touched me so much, I cried reading it, so I'm not going to read it here, but it was about a woman who lost her son in a car accident during the pandemic. And she just couldn't, her two reasons for living, she used to say, were the divine and her family. And she said she felt like she lost both when she lost her son. And I also know somebody who lost a child who had a very strong spiritual connection, and she described it that way as well, that it was so difficult to have any faith or to hold on to any of her beliefs when she was experiencing that much pain. And this woman in your book goes under anesthesia, and she has this profound experience where she's reconnected with her son. And I think when things like that happen to people, of course, I can understand why you saying, well, I don't think bad things really happen would be a controversial statement. But at the same time, when we hear these stories about how people were able to get through these extremely difficult events in their life. And she says, I will never be the same. Grief is a forever experience. It just sort of changes shape. But she was able to take something out of it that was so profound. And she herself was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she just felt like she had this reason to fight and to keep moving forward. When she had this connection with her son, you say in your book that sometimes God speaks to us through our loved ones. And I've had an experience like that myself, which I'll share in a little bit here. But you say that God is talking to us all the time, and that a lot of people sort of push back and say, Neale, maybe it's my imagination. How do I know if it's my imagination or not? And you bring up song lyrics, and I'm laughing here because I'm thinking about this story I've told 100 times where I was thinking about starting a project and I knew it was a little bit too soon. Should I start it? Should I not? And I walked into a gas station. This was pretty recently, and the song Don't Rush Me was playing. And I immediately knew, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to start this project. And I'm sharing it with different friends of mine. My husband operates the same way I do. He was with me in the gas station. He's like, yeah, you're not supposed to start the project. He totally gets it. When I share this with other people, I don't know if they think I have a mental disorder or what have you. But when I think about it, it's like, well, maybe I do, but I still believe this. This is how God communicates with me, because he knows I'm going to take these things as him speaking to me. And you talk about this in your book. You say you might be imagining, but do you believe in what you are imagining? Can you explain that a little bit further? Because I love that you said that.
Well, I asked God that question in my dialogue with God. I wrote down, it was a handwritten dialogue, of course. I never imagined anyone would ever see this. I'm just writing on my yellow legal pad in the privacy of my own bedroom. But I'm writing down, how do I know this is not just my imagination? And God said, what makes you think I wouldn't use your imagination? Why wouldn't I use every tool available to me? Where do you think Mozart's music came from? She said. Where do you think Michelangelo's art came from? Where do you think that any expression of genius comes from if it's not from your imagination? So just because you think it's from your imagination doesn't mean that it's not valid or has no value. In fact, some of the most valuable ideas that ever came to the human race came from someone's pure imagination. So I was given permission then to trust my imagination and to let it be exactly what it is. The result of which was 3,000 pages of dialogue.
3,000 pages.
In 9 separate books in the Conversations with God series.
There's a lot of writing, Neale.
I'm just saying. I didn't think at the beginning that I was trying to write a book. It didn't even occur to me that anyone else, as I said a minute ago, would ever see these very private interactions. But I was told in the first conversation, Neale, you will make of this one day a book, and it will be accessed by many people. And you know what I thought? Nobody's going to publish a book because the guys claim he's talking to God. So I sent my notes to a publisher on a dare.
A dare? Seriously, who dared you? Did they get like a commission for your book sales?
No, I was daring God.
Oh.
I said, I said to God, okay, show me. Because no one's going to publish the book because I claim to be talking to God. But I sent it to three publishers. I didn't send it to the big houses like Random House or Putnam, but I sent it to 3 small independent publishing houses. One of the publishers called me, and he said, "You know what, Mr. Walsch, we want to publish your book." I said, "You're kidding me, seriously?" And he said, "Yes, it's a wonderful work of fiction. It's gonna really." I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. This is not a work of fiction." And he said to me, "Are you thinking this actually happened to you?" I said, "I don't think it happened. I know it happened. This is a work of nonfiction. You cannot publish it as a fiction book." He said, "Well, we thought it was a fantastic fantasy story about a guy who has an ongoing argument, and a conversation with him." I said, No. Forget about it. Forget about publishing. He said, no, not so fast. We'll put it out as a nonfiction book, but it probably isn't going to find 500 readers because the average person isn't going to want to buy a book because a guy claims to be talking back and forth with God. And you know what, Laura? That publisher was right. It didn't find 500 readers. It found 5 million.
Found 5 million. How did that feel when you published that book? Was it that publisher, by the way, who published the book, or was it a different publisher?
No, it was that publisher.
It was that publisher. And what was his reaction? And what was your reaction when your book was starting to sell that many copies?
Well, my reaction was, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. I don't believe it. Are you kidding me? Because, Laura, I'm not bragging. I'm just being honest with you. 7 weeks after the book came out, it was on the New York Times bestseller list.
7 weeks.
It's in a month and a half, a month and a week, or a couple of months. And
so I love that you're saying this, because this is something that so many people, you talk about how our society doesn't really accept this idea that God can communicate with us. And that's why we're so limited in how we interpret and how we hear God every day. And people are what I have discovered having this podcast, Neale, is that people are so hungry for this information, but a lot of people are very terrified to talk about it because it comes off as being weird or strange, because it's not something that's accepted in our society. So it takes bravery to put it out there. But once you do, I think people are just waiting. I think we recognize truth, Neale. I think when I was 19 and I was reading your book, none of my friends were reading spiritual texts in the dorm rooms at Northeastern just yet at 19. But I'm sitting here and I'm reading this book, and we recognize truth. And you talk about that our intuition, our recognition, that is also the way that God communicates with us. And we see the truth and we hear it. And I find it so interesting that God communicated with you that you were going to write this book, but you still didn't really believe that it was going to be the bestseller that it was. And I'm talking to you today. And of course, I've been reminiscing and thinking about how I came to find your first book. And I remember seeing your face on the book jacket and like looking at you and thinking, I'm going to have a conversation with him one day. And I don't know when it is, but I knew that. And I probably just put that away somewhere. And then I started to follow you on Facebook. So I've been following you on Facebook for like 16 years now. And every time I saw one of your posts, I had this sort of feeling of, I should make a note of that so I can ask him about it when I talk to him. And something happened. You posted something a few months ago, and I saw these numbers. I don't remember what they were, but they're numbers that for me mean like something about communication or reaching out to you. And I was like, oh, well, whatever. I mean, I'm sure he's really busy. But I went to your website and I found the phone number, and I just called her and left her a voicemail, and she got back to me. And I thought, well, I knew exactly when I was supposed to reach out to you. I knew I was going to talk to you at some point. And, Oprah recently released a video about this, that her mother or her grandmother was, washing clothes in boiling water outside, and she was cleaning houses, and Oprah was just kind of playing on the porch outside. And her mom looked at her and said, just you wait, you're going to be doing this one day. You should take notes. You should watch what I'm doing. And she just had this feeling like, no, I'm never going to do that. I already know that. And she didn't really know what that voice was, but she believed it and listened to it her whole life. And so I think the older I get, the more I listen to that voice and the more I do believe it as God speaking to me. But I know how rare it is to trust that voice, because where's the proof, right? Where's the evidence? I think people are always asking that question. So I share these stories with people that I have this intuition or this inner voice, or perhaps I hear song lyrics or see numbers that mean something to me. And I use that as a guide for what I'm going to do next. And some people totally get it, and other people probably think I'm totally nuts, although mostly they don't tell me that to my face. I think that what separates people from having faith or believing that maybe they are being communicated with by God is a lack of evidence. They feel that they need more evidence, or they need more proof that God exists, because in the world that we live in, that's what we're always looking for. I can't imagine how many times people have asked you for more evidence and more proof. How do you know that it was God that was speaking to you? What do you say to that? And where do you lead people who are looking for more proof and more evidence?
Well, how I know it was God speaking to me is because of what I was told. The information that came to me was, by and large, information, messages, if you please, that I never heard before from any other source. In fact, they were messages that directly contradicted what I was taught as a child and what my culture has shown me in my 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I realized, oh, wow, this is really, really coming from a whole different source. And the messages contain such love and such joy and a sense of such freedom that I decided, by God, this is God talking to me. And I asked God, why me? Why would you talk to me? And God immediately answered, sweetheart, I talk to everybody all the time. The question is not to whom am I talking? The question is, who is listening?
Who is listening? Have you started to be able to identify, not started, but I'm sure you've been practicing this for quite some time at this point, considering you published your first book in 1995. But I know for me, there's this loving voice that I know when it comes to me, it's the voice of God. There's also a very shame-filled negative voice that I have often misinterpreted as being God when it's not. Have you gotten pretty good at figuring out the difference between the two? Like, do you get this gut feeling when you know you're being communicated with?
Yes, I do. And the messages that are coming to me from the divine are always messages of peace, joy, freedom, fearlessness, and love. And if you don't contain those characteristics, then I realize, that's a message that my mind is pulling out from somewhere else.
You said that when you were interviewed on a morning talk show, someone asked you to summarize in 30 seconds, what does God want them to know about himself?
That was Matt Lauer.
Matt Lauer. Wow. I didn't know from the book that stayed anonymous, but Matt Lauer, I guess, asked you to summarize in 30 seconds.
Yeah, we were on the Today Show, and to be fair to Matt, we had about a 9 or 10 minute interview, but he waited until the last minute. I guess the idea occurred to him. He said, Neale, if you really think you talk to God, what's God's most important message to the world? He said, could you put it in a paragraph or two? We only have 30 seconds. And I thought to myself, you little stinker, you would wait until we have 30 seconds left in the interview to ask me the most important question of all time. But of course. I thought, how am I going to answer him? And then God gave me the answer to give to him right then and there. So I looked at Matt and I said, Matt, I don't need 30 seconds. I don't need one paragraph. I can tell you God's most important message to the world in 5 words. So Matt Lauer looked at the TV camera and he said, with just a touch of sardonic flavor in his voice, ladies and gentlemen, Neale Donald Walsch, with God's most important message to the world. Neale? I looked at the camera and I said, God's most important message to the world in 5 words? You've got me all wrong.
You've got me all wrong. And what do you think? What do we have the most wrong about God? What belief that we have about God do you think is the most backwards? And what, if you could share with anyone now, what we should get right, what we should know about him, what would that be?
What we've got God wrong about, the most damaging thing that we misunderstand about God is that we think that God is judgmental, condemning, and punishing. We think that God is needy, that God requires us to love, that God actually commanded us to love, that God commanded us to pay attention to what he's saying, that God made other commandments as well. For instance, as an example, just to use one example, when I was 9 years old, I was attending a Catholic school, and the priest came in to teach the Catholic catechism. He came in once a week to teach the children the dogma of the church, and he was talking about mortal sin. I said, what's a mortal sin? He said, it's a sin that's not forgiven if you don't go to confession. A priest can forgive you, but if you die, in the state of sin, you would go to hell forever. And of course, I'm 9 years old. I said, oh, wow. Can you give me an example, Father, of a mortal sin? He said, certainly, my son. Well, I thought he was going to say, murder or stealing someone's life savings or whatever. He said, it's a mortal sin if you miss Mass on Sunday.
Oh my God, that had to be terrifying for you. Did you know that wasn't true, or were you really scared?
No, of course I was scared, because that very Sunday, for the first time in like many, many weeks, I did miss Mass because I went to the playground to play in the World Series of softball. I was on the softball team at the playground, and they had one of the games was Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. So I missed Mass. I thought, well, it's okay. And I went to play the game because I was on the team. Now, the priest is telling me 3 days later, if you die with that sin on your soul, you're going to hell forever.
Forever, burning in hell forever. I mean, the threat of that for a young child, my kids are scared of like a bug being in their room. I can't even imagine carrying that around, right?
Of course, I'm saying my prayers because the church didn't have confession except one day a week on Saturdays. This is a Wednesday. So every night I'm praying to God. Prayer we were all taught to say when we were 9 years old. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I beg the Lord my soul to take. It's like, I'm lying there and shaking and quivering and crying out to God. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to disobey you by missing church one Sunday in my life. Of course, I went to confession and I got absolution. And I could relax about that. But when I got to be 19, 10 years later, I began to think, is this the God I think really exists that would send a person to hell for missing church one Sunday in his life? Or, for instance, in another faith, if you're a woman, you have to wear a certain garment that covers your entire body and allows you only to see a little slit that lets your eyes so you can see where you're walking. But if you don't wear the hijab, you are disobeying God's command and you could be sent to hell. Is this the kind of a God that we believe in, that we really think exists, that punishes people for the most trivial so-called offenses? Or is it possible, just possible, that there's something we don't fully understand here about God and about ourselves and about life, the understanding of which would change everything?
Before we continue with this episode of I Just Have to Say with Laura Max, this episode is brought to you by Styled by ALV. Styled by ALV brings you custom merchandise, styled events, and tablescapes here in Aspen, Colorado. From bridal and baby showers to corporate events, Styled by ALV specializes in branding and personalizing your celebration or gathering and making it an occasion to remember. If you want your friends and family to attend your Aspen gathering and never forget it because they brought home a piece of merch that they use all the time. I'm talking water bottles, hats, koozies, shirts, sweatshirts, cups, hats, you name it. Styled by ALV has it, and they're going to make it something your guests actually want to use and actually wear. They'll create a logo for your event. They'll come up with tablescapes that make your party absolutely gorgeous. You do not want to plan an event in Aspen, Colorado without Styled by ALV. If you want to work with them on your next event, you can head on over to Instagram, follow them at Styled by ALV, or visit their website, styledbyalv.com, and you can use the contact form to get in touch with them. Styled by ALV is your go-to resource for all things party planning in Aspen, Colorado. I viscerally relate to what you're sharing, especially that you were 19 when you started to question it, because I was exactly the same age. I know that, you were a young child when you heard this very terrifying piece of information that, I'm sure so many children still hear information like that. And I love that you brought up childhood, because one of the biggest sort of windows into my understanding of God, I have 3 children. I know you have tripled me in that. You have 9, but I have 3. And I look at how I feel about them, right? Which to me, I've always imagined is this microcosm of how God feels about all of us. And I look at what I want for them and the unconditional love that I feel for them. And there's no way that I could feel this for them and that God could feel all the ways that you were told he would feel if you missed mass, right? And I imagine, somebody once told me when I was 19 that they imagined God. They once saw a baby being carried by its mother on the subway, and the subway was just full of like crazy people, and it was really crowded and it was really chaotic, but the baby was just sleeping so peacefully. And the mom was just carrying this baby. And she imagines God as being that mother, just carrying her through everything and protecting her. And I also love to think of this visual of crossing the street when you're a child. When you're crossing the street as a child, you're not tall enough to see the incoming danger and the traffic. So you have a parent there standing with you who can see the cars coming and who can tell you when it's safe to cross the street and hold your hand and walk you across the street. I think of God as the same way. I believe that God sees things that I can't see and is there with my best interest in mind to protect me. I'm not 100% sure, and maybe you have some insight into this, where we got this sort of collective idea that God was standing on the throne, punishing all of us, waiting to give out his judgment.
Of course, we got it from our religions. Laura, there are 4,243 religions currently being practiced on the face of the earth.
It's true. That is true, but a lot of them, I mean, it's not necessarily, it's the religion, it's also the interpretation of the religion in a lot of cases.
The majority of religions teach us of a God who is judgmental, condemning, and punishing. Not every religion, but the vast majority of religions do teach us of a God who is judgmental, condemning, and punishing. A God who has certain things that she or he needs to occur, and things that cannot occur. For instance, again, to give you another example, when I was a child, we were taught that eating meat on Fridays was a sin. A sin against God to eat meat on Fridays. So we had to have meatless Fridays. The religions of the world have trained us to hold God in a place of fear, that God has certain things that God needs, and if we disobey, including loving him, God actually, we're told that God commands us to love him. Wow.
Wow.
I hope I never have to command anyone to love me.
Well, what I think about often is, yes, we do have these religions, but why did we so ferociously adopt them, Neale? Like, why did we decide to take them on? And as a parent, I theorize that the idea of having this sort of authority and control that we then, historically have also wielded onto our children as parents, I think that there has been this sort of sense of safety around that, or like sense of needing to control others and to be controlled ourselves. Do you agree with that?
Of course, that's exactly why.
Yeah, it's scary not to have that.
And it
for people.
relieves us of the responsibility of having to determine, what our next decision should be, what our next choice should be, what our ideas around right and wrong should be. So, of course, we're grateful that religion at least takes that burden off of us and simply tells us, this is what's good, this is what's bad, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and this is what you are commanded to do. Just obey the rules and you'll be fine. And so that's the reason.
You had this Catholic upbringing, and you talk about having an interest in spirituality from a very young age, which I also really relate to. Do you find in your adult life, did you take anything from that Catholic upbringing like that still helps you in your life today, or did you sort of leave most of it behind when you adopted a different idea of God?
No, I took much of what I was taught in the Catholic Church, and I want to make the point that I believe all religions share great wisdom, great insight. Here are some messages that I took with me from my Catholic teaching, what I was told as a Catholic. Bless your enemies.
I love that.
Pray for those who persecute you. And when a man slaps you on the right cheek, turn and offer him your left.
I've never heard that before.
And when a man steals your coat, give him your shirt as well. And when a man demands that you walk 1 mile with him, go with him 20.
Oh, I love all of those. So how do we like make sense of that? How do we make sense of these beautiful, I've already mentioned this on the show before, but I'm Jewish, and I take so much from my religion every day. And I had to experience what I experienced when I was 19 in order to better be able to take in my religion and the beautiful things about it that I do love, because I was raised not in the exact same way as you, but I definitely was taught ideas about God that were very, very harmful to me and my understanding of myself and God and the world around me. And I had to relearn those things. So only later on, and I've talked about this on a previous episode with Rabbi Shais Taub, was I able to actually take in these beautiful parts of my religion that they're a huge part of my faith and who I am today. What do you make of the fact that, we can get all these beautiful lessons from religion and ways to live our life, and that we've also seen so much destruction at the hands of what we've learned from different faiths and different religions?
What I take from it is that we're simply not paying attention. Or we may be paying attention, but we're not giving it our attention. That is, we're paying attention, but we're not giving it intention. It's not our intention to behave in a way which produces the outcomes that we say we desire. Humanity is an interesting species. We say we want peace and joy and happiness and love and a fair chance and abundance for everyone. We say these things, but we don't act that way. The question is, what could cause us to behave in the way that we say will produce the outcomes that we pretend or declare that we wish to produce.
You talk about people finding your book and your books or stumbling upon your work because they're ready for it or they've asked for it in some way. You talk about that in God Talk, and you've talked about it in your previous books. I remember reading about it in Happier Than God when I was 19. And I remember believing that. And I remember that feeling of, oh, like I had this question and this is the answer. I think a lot of people, I mean, this was certainly my story, reach out for books like yours on the shelf, perhaps because the messages that they've gotten about God and who and what God is have maybe caused them so much pain. That was certainly my experience in their life, that they're looking for a different answer. And I think what happens for a lot of us, what certainly happened for me, is that the voice of the authority figures in our lives, the voices of our parents, start to become the voice of God. And we start to get the two very, very confused, which is why, a lot of psychologists say, the way that you speak to your children is so very important because it becomes the voice in their head, which is true. I watch that all the time. The way we speak to them becomes the way that they speak to themselves. When you have been spoken to in your life in a way that has made you feel unworthy or has made you feel hopeless, how do you open yourself up to another way of being when you have lived that way, in many cases, for so long? I remember reading your book, and while I was reading it, feeling like, oh, I can breathe. Okay, I'm going to be okay. And then I'd put it down, and it was like my brain would go right back to the way that it had been functioning my whole life. And it took a lot of repetition for me to finally understand this new way of understanding God and knowing that God loved me. When people come to you and they've spent their lifetimes perhaps in one state of mind and they're hoping to shift into another, how do people do that? How do we change the way that we think every day?
I ask them two questions. The first thing I say to a person who comes to me in the way you've described, I say to them, where would you be without your story? Where do you think you'd be if you didn't have a story that you're not good enough, you're not worthy, you're not there, you're not doing it right, you can never get it right, you're not okay, you have much to do in order to improve. Where would you be without your story? And we talk about that usually with individuals interactively for a while. Then I'll ask them the second question. When something unwelcome enters your life or occurs in your experience, what do you think that has to do with the agenda of your soul? And I invite people to ask themselves that question. If someone's having a quarrel with them or disagreement with them, or they're faced with any unwelcome event whatsoever, I say to them, ask yourself this question. Now, what does this have to do with the agenda of my soul? And that recontextualizes the exterior experience. It allows you to consider it in an entirely new way. Of course, if we don't know what the agenda of our soul is, then we're going to have a problem. So what I help people to understand is that we all share the same agenda. The agenda of our soul is identical for all of us. In my understanding, I could be wrong, of course, but my understanding is that each of us are spiritual entities having come into the realm of the physical in order to experience and to demonstrate our true identity as individuations of divinity.
And we are all therefore a part of God, as you say, that we're not separate.
That's my understanding.
We're not separate.
Not only are we not separate from God, we're not separate from each other.
We're not separate from each other. My oldest daughter said the most amazing thing. My father passed away a year and a half ago, and very shortly thereafter, my stepfather passed away. So all of my kids were getting like this fiery introduction to death, like rapid fire pace. And we were talking about it a lot. And I felt like I was having to explain to them, we've had a lot of loss recently. Ideally, that's not going to be the norm going forward. But I was reading books to them about death and trying to talk to them about it to make sure they understood what was going on, because they were very young at the time. And my oldest said, Mom, I think when people die, God gets bigger. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, I think, we go home to be with God and we just become part of him and he gets bigger. And I said, you really are a rabbi, kiddo. She's really amazing. It's incredible. But I believe that to be true as well. And then my middle daughter recently said, we were talking about God. We were talking about our spiritual journeys. And she said, Mommy, we come here on a great adventure. And then we get to go home. And I'm like, you're 5. I mean, it's like really amazing, but I totally agree with her. It's
You
really,
know what? You
it's
know what
true.
they say. You know what they say. Out of the mouths of babes.
Out of the mouths of babes. I mean, like, yes, you are correct, my dear. We do. We come here on this great adventure and we're in this body and we go home. And I think looking at things through that lens, you're saying when you get into an argument with somebody, when you have something difficult happen to you, for many, many years now, I've been looking at those experiences, not as the experiences themselves, but as, okay, what am I learning from this? Why is this person in my life? Why am I getting this exact same client over and over again in a different body? Like, why is this type of person continuing to come into my life and what do I need to learn from it? Instead of looking at it the way I think societally we look at a lot of things, which is this is a problem and I need to make it go away. I need to like cut myself off from it. I think I've learned that it does keep coming back until we learn from it. And speaking of relationships, you do talk in your book about spousal relationships, about partnerships, and about the way that we treat each other in those relationships. And do you believe that what God wants for us and the way that we're supposed to treat each other is similar to the way that God feels about us? Do you believe that we're meant to give each other unconditional love at all times? I mean, what does that look like? You talked about it briefly in your book, but I wanted to ask you more about it.
Well, first of all, I don't think that God wants us to behave in any particular way. But God might have a desire for us to do so. And there's a semantic difference in the use of those words, but without getting into a long semantic
I trust you. Go ahead.
But I think that pure love means that we love without needing, requiring, asking for, and expecting, or even hoping for anything in return.
Yes.
And
now that would just pause for 1 second. Now that is beautiful and also very like counter to what we are taught about relationships, societally speaking.
Sure, because we think that love is a quid pro quo.
Oh my God. Yes, we do. Like everywhere, everywhere we have legal agreements that like detail the quid pro quo in many cases. I mean, that understanding of love is everywhere. And so I was reading that and I thought, man, I have to ask him if he believes that in every type of relationship up to a marital relationship, we're supposed to really love without expecting everything in return. Do you believe that?
Including a marital relationship.
Including. Yes, that's what I meant to. Up to the level of and including. Yes.
Yeah, including. Yes. So
that I think right there is going to be mind blowing to a lot of people.
It took me a long time to remember that.
Yeah.
Come to my present marriage. Is in its 17th year, but for me, that's a record because I had previous marriages. It didn't last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So, but I got to the 17th year in my present marriage because I decided, you know what? I do not require or need or even hope for anything in return from this person because my love for her has to do with who she is. Not who she makes me, not what she gives. I don't love her because of what I can get out of her. I love her because of just standing there across the room all by herself. I totally adore who she is at every level. I don't need any of that to flow back to me in order for me to continue loving her. And that's the way God loves us. God does not need our love in return, much less command it.
Yeah. I remember always getting like a very uncomfortable feeling with the word, I don't want to say the word worship, but maybe it is the word worship. Just this idea that I needed to exactly what you're saying, and I'm not articulating it in the right way, but I didn't like this idea that it was a quid pro quo when it was God. I kind of understood that at a very young age. I'm like, you're this sort of fountain of unconditional love for me, a mere mortal over here. And I don't know how I'm supposed to do all that. I mean, I was getting those messages when I was very young. And so that little feeling in my gut is one that I've learned to listen to much more strongly over time. And you talk in your book about different ways that God communicates with us, be it through, words on a page, things that we hear on the street, somebody who says something to us at the right time. You also talk about how people will often hear the messages of God through their lost loved ones, people who've left this earth. I have this incredible story that I had to share because I thought of it when I was reading your book. When my father passed away, I immediately hired a medium. I couldn't wait to chat with him after he died by hiring a medium because when he was dying, he wasn't really there anymore. So I was like, kind of like, as he was going out, I'm like, okay, I'm calling this person the second you're gone so we can chat because I really miss you. So he died. I was there when he died. I waited probably a week I reached out to someone who was referred to me as being an excellent medium. I had never reached out to a medium in my life, but I was very open to the idea. I spoke to her. She asked me if my father's name was Robert, which it is. I don't know how she would have known that. So she lives in London, knows absolutely nothing about me. She starts telling me about my dad. I immediately start crying, like everything you see on TV when people are talking to mediums. We have this amazing experience, and he basically tells me everything I already knew. I just wanted to hear him say it. And it was a wonderful experience for me. And I figured this is the last time I'm ever going to talk about this or talk to a medium about my father. And about a year passed, and I'm driving, and I get this just overwhelming sensation that I need to email her and ask her about my dad, that like my dad is really trying to tell me something. And it was during a period of my life where I was very overwhelmed. And I have 3 children. I'm working full time. My schedule was insane. I was just waking up and like on the hamster wheel every day and not taking nearly enough time for myself. Anyway, I have this overwhelming feeling to reach out to her, and like some overwhelming feelings that I got really busy and just totally forgot about doing it. And 2 hours later, I'm sitting in my car. I open up my email and I have a message from her. And she says, Laura, I know this might sound strange and I really never do this, but I think your father's trying to tell you something. Do you want to talk to me? Yes. So her name is Laura too, same name as me. I'm like, Laura, I can't even breathe. Can you get on the phone with me right now? This is the craziest thing I've ever experienced. She said, I can call you tomorrow. So I have to wait 24 hours. We get on the phone and she says, your dad really, really wants you to slow down. Like he says that you're doing so much and you just have so much going on in your life. And how can you take things off of your plate? And he's watching you every day. And he really wants you to know that like he sees everything you're doing. And he wants to know like how you can make your life easier because he wants you to laugh more. And I already knew what he was going to say, Neale. Like I knew the whole thing, but I couldn't believe it. And there were only like a few people I could call and share the story with, but I feel God speaking to me every day. I mean, before I got on this phone call, I felt like God was speaking to me through somebody. It was one of those just like moments I'll never forget. And I think if we open ourselves up to those moments, and this is why I was just so excited to interview you today. If we open ourselves up to those moments, if we allow for that in our life, like that is the portal to having them and to really experiencing the miraculousness of that, because I completely believe you and I completely agree that God really is trying to speak to us all the time.
Not just trying, but actually succeeding. The question is not whether God is succeeding in communicating with us all the time. The question is whether we are succeeding in opening to that communication.
I love that. Well, the last question I'm going to ask you in that case is, if we're hearing this for the first time, if this is totally new information and a totally new worldview, what would you recommend for somebody who has never listened, who is interested in listening? Where could they start?
Well, they could decide that there's more going on here than meets the eye. They could take a close look at life and say, wait a minute. This isn't quite as simple as I thought it was. And there's more happening here. Then they could decide that it's possible. The first step would be to acknowledge the possibility that there really is an entity called God, or Allah, or Yahweh, or Brahman, or whatever word you want to use to describe the higher power. And that not only is it possible that the higher power exists, but it's possible that this essence will speak and is speaking to all of us all the time. So that's the first step, stepping into the possibility that it could in fact be true. Then the second step would be worthiness, to accept, maybe God does talk to people like Moses or Muhammad, bless his holy name, or Jesus, or whoever we think that God talked to, but God wouldn't talk to me. Yeah, I mean, he may talk to the Pope, but he's not going to talk to me. So we have to accept our worthiness. And that's a huge thing for most people to accept. I am worthy to be spoken to directly by the source of divinity in the universe. And then we take the step of willingness to decide that we are willing to do so, in spite of the fact that people will think we're crazy if we share it with anybody. But we're willing to do it anyway. And in fact, some religions will do more than think that we're crazy. Some religions will tell us we are blaspheming, that we are an apostate, that we are a heretic, and they will accuse us of heresy. So we have to be willing to overcome the cultural bias against such a notion. Then we take the fourth step, which is wakefulness. Stay awake. because God is communicating with us in 100 ways across 1,000 moments in 1,000,000 lifetimes. And then the fifth step is to accept the messages we are receiving. Don't reject them and say, it's just my imagination. But accept the messages that we are receiving, the lyrics of the next song you hear on the radio, as was mentioned, whatever it might be, the coincidence of getting an email from that person. Wait a minute, there's more going on here than meets the eye. So I think those are some steps that we can take. And I love what William Shakespeare wrote in the play Hamlet, what he said when he wrote in the dialogue to Horatio. Hamlet says to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So what kind of advice would I give people? Consider the possibility that we don't have all the answers, that there's something that we could add to our data bank that would expand our life beyond anything we could have previously imagined. I promise you, folks, there's more going on here than meets the eye. How is God communicating with us? How does God tell us what's true, that even God talks to us? Consider the possibility that this very podcast you're listening to falls into that category.
I love it. I love it, Neale. Thank you very much. Thank you for being my guest. It has been such an honor to have you on, truly.
Well, I've enjoyed being here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience for whatever value it might have, even if those disagree. Even if a person disagrees with everything I've said, at least they've been placed more closely in touch with their own inner truth, and that itself is a service. So thank you for the opportunity to share this time with you.
I love that. I love that. Thank you all so much for joining us today. You've been listening to I Just Have to Say with Laura Max. If you would like to purchase Neale's book, God Talk, or any of the others, I will put the link in the show notes to his website and to his new book and to his Facebook page, which I have been loyally following for a decade and a half. Thank you again, Neale, for coming on the show, and I look forward to joining you all again next time.
Wonderful. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Neale. You were wonderful. Truly.